I'm here at the studios of KALW in San Francisco with Michael Watts. He's professor of geography and development studies at UC Berkeley. We just finished a show talking about what's happening on the ground in Nigeria. And Professor Watts first went to Nigeria in 1972. He is author of the incredible book, Curse of the Black Gold, 50 Years of Oil in the Niger Delta. And Professor Watts, you know, Nigeria is getting some attention in the U.S. because of Occupy Nigeria, the violence on the ground, oil pipelines exploding, but there's so much context missing. What do you think Americans need to know about what is happening in Nigeria?
Well, I'd start with the fact that probably most Americans aren't aware of the fact that somewhere between 10 and 15% of all of the oil imported into the United States comes from Nigeria, which is to say, if you drive a car, the chances are in some way you have a very intimate relationship with Nigeria, whether you know it or not. Secondly, Nigeria is arguably the most important country, or one of the most important countries on the African continent. Geostrategically, politically, economically, it's a huge economy, $250 billion. 1 in 5 Africans is a Nigerian. The population is actually growing quite quickly. It's 160 million now. Some people expect it to be 400 million by the middle of the century. So it's a hugely important country. It played a big role in various civil wars in the African continent and so on and so forth. So for both of those reasons, I think it's very important. And lastly, really since 2005, Nigeria has really had to confront some serious political instability, and that's taken, at this moment in history, two forms, two insurgencies, really. One is in the oil-producing region of Nigeria, where since 2005 we had a militant group who claimed that they wanted resource control and some type of compensation for the ecological damage footprint of the oil industry. And more recently, in the north of the country, the Muslim north, far away from the oil-producing zone, we've seen the rise of militant Islamist groups, and one in particular called Boko Haram, which detonated a bomb in the capital city in a United Nations compound, and just a week ago launched major attacks in which almost 200 people were killed in the major city in the north. So there are two insurgencies. And, you know, we hear a lot these days about banks being too big to fail. Well, I think Nigeria is a country that's too big to fail. And with these two political challenges right now, it's a very important moment for all of us.
So you've got 160 million people. The oil revenue brings in about $45 billion a year. But the majority of Nigerians live on less than $1 a day. In some parts of the country, you've got a 70% unemployment rate.
Correct. Nigeria is a particular type of political economy. It's what we could call an oil-dependent state. Nigeria became an oil producer in 1958, a couple of years before political independence from the British. And by 1970, it was a major producer, the 9th, 10th largest oil producer in the world, and has been, since then, producing 2 to 2.5 million barrels per day. What does that mean? It means a lot of money comes flowing into the Nigerian government. Sometimes 40, 50. A year ago, it was up to $70 billion. So it's an oil-dependent state, and a relatively wealthy state, it needs to be said, because of that oil revenue. And yet, if you take a look at what's happened to those oil revenues, how those oil revenues has been spent, what you see is an astonishing failure. That by most estimations, perhaps something like $400 or $500 billion of the $1 trillion of oil monies that have flowed into that country have simply disappeared, is how the World Bank talked about it. They're in Swiss bank accounts. They've been stolen. And of that remaining money that was actually invested in some way or another, or allocated by the Nigerian government to other states in the federation, it's a federal system like our own, much of that had very little impact on the daily lives, the life chances, the well-being of Nigerians. The life expectancy right now of a Nigerian is 47 years old. 70% of the population live below the poverty line. So in a sense, just to describe that rather differently, you could say that oil has produced a catastrophic failure of development. And that's not unrelated to these political crises we've been talking about.
And we're talking about the 5 major oil companies, Shell, Exxon, Chevron, Total SA, and the Italian Eni. They run joint ventures with the Nigerian National Petroleum Company, pumping more than 90% of the country's crude. And this book is incredible. Again, Michael Watts wrote the text for Curse of the Black Gold. The photos were taken by Ed Kashi. And I just want to flip through some of these photos. They're so incredible. Just talk to us a little bit about how, it's just incredible photos, life for the people. And what solutions do they see? I mean, what do they want? What changes do they want to see?
Well, obviously, one of the things that Ed and I tried to do in the book was to try to give a sense, particularly for an American readership, incidentally, what the costs of oil have been in this country, and that we do have a connection with it.
Right.
And so many of these images you see are very powerful. A number of them focus on the ecological footprint of the oil and gas industry. Oil spills, gas flaring, dredging of rivers, all of these things. And incidentally, this is an area in which primarily we're talking about rural, agricultural and fishing communities. Many of these forms of livelihood have been devastated by the impact of the industry. Their livelihood systems have simply fallen apart because of pollution and so on. And many of these images here just show the extraordinary challenges that poor people in the region face.
You know, we're so disconnected from what we put into our pumps. When the BP disaster happened, of course, it deservedly got a lot of attention. But you point out that this happens every year in Nigeria, and there are about 5 oil spills every day?
That's correct. It's been estimated by the Nigerian petroleum company, the national oil company, which works with Exxon and BP and so on, Shell, that there have been over 8,000 oil spills since 1970. And you're right, the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, which was devastating, of course, when we saw the oil spill in the Gulf. This happens, an equivalent of a Gulf of Mexico spill happens every year and has happened pretty much every year since 1970. So this region, it's a beautiful tropical rainforest area with extraordinary swamp rainforests and so on, is probably one of the most polluted spots on the face of the earth.
This is one of my favorite photos. It's an oil pipeline creating a walkway for this young woman. And I'll kind of zoom in here. This is a Shell oil umbrella.
That's right. It's an astonishing image because it gives a viewer a real palpable sense of how immediate in people's lives oil is. The region is crisscrossed by thousands of kilometers of oil pipelines and flow stations and so on. And this is just one small community in Rivers State, and you can see that literally it's running through the community. Children and men and women have to clamber over these pipelines, many of which, of course, are corroded. They're not looked after. And indeed, not only do you have corrosion and spillage and so on, but in many of these impoverished communities, communities attempt to rupture these pipelines to drain off some of the oil they can, which is an extraordinarily dangerous thing to do.
And we have just about 30 seconds or about a minute left. What change would you like to see? How could the lives of the Nigerian people, how could their lives improve?
I think there are several ways. One, actually, points a finger at us in the United States, and I think that a part of this story is holding oil companies accountable in various sorts of ways. And there are pieces of legislation that are working their way through the U.S. government and so on. We know Halliburton, for example, was fined as part of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act a couple of years ago over, I think it was close to $300 million for illegal payments made with respect to the oil company, the oil sector in Nigeria. So that's one. A second would be to support and endorse and work with civil society groups that are attempting to make not just the oil industry, but the revenue of the allocation of oil revenue more accountable, and especially at the local government level, to ensure that if a government claims it's going to do things, it does.
Michael Watts is author of the incredible book, Curse of the Black Gold. Be sure to click on the link under this video, take a look at the photos, and watch the movie. Thank you so much, Michael, and thanks for your work.
Thank you very much.